My name is Sage Delacroix, and I am 24 years old. In just a few hours, I was scheduled to serve champagne and canapés at the Blackwood University Benefactor's Gala, an event where the architects of my misery would toast to their own generosity. They had no idea that the struggling, invisible scholarship student they barely registered was about to become the reason their gilded world came crashing down. They thought they had broken me, but they had only made me sharper. They had only given me a reason to burn it all to the ground. The moment it all started wasn't loud or dramatic. It was quiet, insidious, a venom seeping into the foundations of everything I had worked for. I was sitting in Professor Albright's advanced macroeconomics lecture, a class I adored, a class I knew inside and out. I had just gotten back my midterm, a test I'd studied for weeks to ace. The grade, scrawled in angry red ink at the top, was a C-. It was impossible. It felt like a physical blow. As my mind reeled, trying to find a rational explanation, I saw him. Tristan Sterling, heir to the Sterling manufacturing fortune, slid an envelope onto Albright's lectern after class. It was a subtle, practiced movement. Albright didn't even flinch. He just nodded, a slight, almost imperceptible dip of his chin, before sweeping the envelope into his briefcase. That night, Tristan's C- magically became an A+ on the online grade portal. And I knew my failing grade wasn't about my performance. It was a message. It was the price of someone else's success. This whole system was designed to crush people like me, and for a long time I let it. If you've ever felt like the world was rigged against you, hit that like button. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from, because this story is for anyone who has ever been underestimated. Don't forget to subscribe, because you won't want to miss how this ends. My journey to Blackwood University wasn't paved with legacy connections or trust funds. It was paved with cracked asphalt from the parking lot of the 24-hour diner where my mom worked double shifts. It was built on the foundation of secondhand textbooks with other students' notes in the margins, on late nights fueled by cheap coffee and a desperate, clawing hunger for something more. Growing up, our home was filled with love, but it was a love measured in sacrifices. New shoes for me meant my mom wore her old ones until the soles flapped. A school trip fee meant a week of eating nothing but pasta and tomato sauce. I wasn't a genius, not in the way people at Blackwood were. My intelligence wasn't effortless or dazzling. It was dogged. It was relentless. I worked 3 times as hard as everyone else just to be considered average. I gave up parties, friendships, and any semblance of a normal teenage life. Every waking moment was a calculation. How to study for my AP exams while finishing a shift at the local library. How to write scholarship essays between loads of laundry. When the acceptance letter from Blackwood arrived, it felt like a miracle. A thick, cream-colored envelope that weighed more than any letter had a right to. The words "full academic scholarship" seemed to hum with a light of their own. My mom cried. She held the letter to her chest and whispered, "You did it, baby. You got out." We both knew what she meant. Out of the cycle of just getting by, out of the small town where dreams went to die, out of a life defined by what we lacked. The first day on campus was a culture shock so profound it felt like I had landed on another planet. The air smelled different, cleaner, tinged with the scent of old money and freshly cut grass. Students glided across the manicured lawns in clothes that cost more than my family's monthly rent. They talked about summering in the Hamptons and ski trips to Aspen with a casualness that made my head spin. Their names were not just names, they were brands. Sterling, Vanderbilt, DuPont. They moved with an unthinking confidence, a certainty that this world belonged to them, because it did. I, on the other hand, felt like an imposter in a stolen skin. My clothes were from a discount store. My laptop was a refurbished model that whirred ominously, and my accent felt thick and clumsy in my mouth. I was an afterthought, a diversity statistic to be patted on the head, a charity case meant to make the wealthy feel magnanimous. The favoritism wasn't subtle. The legacy students, the Tristans of the world, were treated with a familiar warmth by professors who had known their parents, or even their grandparents. Their questions were always insightful, their late assignments always understandable. My raised hand was often overlooked, my questions met with a sigh of impatience. There was one exception, Professor Anya Sharma. She taught sociological theory, and she was the first person at Blackwood who looked at me and didn't see a charity case. She saw a mind. Professor Sharma was a force of nature, a brilliant, sharp-edged woman who had fought her own way up from a background not so different from mine. She was on the scholarship selection committee, and she later told me my application essay about the economic sociology of a small-town diner had made her fight for me. In our first one-on-one meeting, she fixed me with her intense, dark eyes. "Sage," she said, her voice low and direct, "you have a formidable intellect. Do not let anyone here convince you otherwise." She paused, stirring her tea. "But you must understand something about this place. Blackwood runs on two currencies, money and power. Merit is a distant, often devalued, third. Be careful who you trust. Merit can be a very lonely currency here." Her words were a warning, a cryptic piece of advice that I didn't fully understand at the time. I thought she was just talking about social exclusion, about the snobbery of the elite. I didn't realize she was handing me a key, a guide to a hidden war I was already losing. That warning became my armor. The neglect and dismissal I faced in my classes didn't crush me, it hardened me. While the other students were networking at exclusive clubs I couldn't afford to join, I was in the library, devouring books. Every condescending glance from a professor, every snickering comment from a legacy student became fuel. I developed a work ethic that was less a habit and more a weapon. I became fiercely independent, meticulously organized, and obsessively observant. I learned to live on the fringes, to watch and to listen. I tracked the subtle dynamics of the classroom, which students received extensions without question, whose mediocre comments were praised as genius. I started keeping a private journal, not of feelings but of facts, dates, times, names, incidents. The C- from Professor Albright wasn't the first instance of unfairness, but it was the first time I saw the mechanism behind it, the quiet exchange of an envelope. Professor Sharma's words echoed in my mind. Money and power. The hardship I endured wasn't just building character. It was honing me into the exact instrument needed to expose the rot at the heart of Blackwood University. The final straw didn't land on my back, but on that of my friend, Liam. He was another scholarship kid, a brilliant computer science major from rural Montana with a heart bigger than his home state. He was kind, perpetually optimistic, and the only person besides Professor Sharma who made me feel like I belonged at Blackwood. We were study partners, commiserating over instant noodles in the common room of our dorm, the one unofficially designated for the scholarship students. One Tuesday afternoon, I found him sitting on his bed, staring at a formal letter from the university. His face was pale, his hands trembling. He had been expelled. The charge was plagiarism on his midterm coding project. "I didn't do it, Sage," he whispered, his voice cracking. "I swear to you, I wrote every single line of that code myself. They said it was identical to Tristan Sterling's project." My blood ran cold. Tristan Sterling couldn't code his way out of a paper bag. Everyone knew his projects were ghostwritten by a team of private tutors. "They're framing you, Liam," I said, the words tasting like acid. He just shook his head, defeated. His scholarship was revoked. He was being sent home in disgrace. I saw the shame in his eyes, the utter devastation of a dream being stolen from him by people who could afford to buy a replacement. Seeing him pack his bags, his bright future extinguished by a casual act of corruption, was the definitive moment. This wasn't just about unfair grades anymore, this was about destroying lives. The weight of it all crushed me. For a full day, I couldn't move. I lay in my bed, the ceiling pressing down on me, the injustice and unbearable physical pressure in my chest. All the work, all the sacrifice, all the hope my mom had poured into mate was all for nothing in a place where truth was a commodity. A wave of fury finally broke through the despair. I couldn't let them get away with it. I booked an appointment with the Dean of Students, a man named Dean Holloway whose portrait hung in the main hall, smiling benevolently. His office was a shrine to self-importance, all dark wood and leather-bound books he'd likely never read. I sat before his massive desk, my hands clenched in my lap, and I laid it all out. My suspicions about Professor Albright, the incident with Tristan's grade, and now Liam's expulsion. I spoke calmly, rationally, presenting the facts as I knew them. Dean Holloway listened with a placid, dismissive smile. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers. "Miss Delacroix," he said, his tone dripping with condescension. "Blackwood is a very demanding institution. It requires a certain caliber of student. It's not uncommon for those from less rigorous academic backgrounds to find the pressure overwhelming. Sometimes they look for external factors to blame for their own shortcomings. He picked up a pen, tapping it on his desk. Perhaps you are simply not Blackwood material. You should be grateful for the opportunity you've been given, not look for conspiracies where there are none. His words were a dismissal so total, so patronizing, that it stole the air from my lungs. He was explicitly telling me I was lesser, that my reality was a fiction born of my own inadequacy. He didn't even try to investigate. He had already judged me, already convicted me of not belonging. I walked out of his office in a daze, the failed confrontation echoing in my head. My isolation was complete. The system wasn't just broken, it was designed this way, and he was one of its chief architects. That evening, I went to the only person I could trust. I found Professor Sharma in her office, surrounded by stacks of books that seemed to form a protective fortress around her. I told her everything, about Liam, about my meeting with Dean Holloway, about the envelope I saw Tristan give to Professor Albright. I broke down, the tears I had been holding back finally spilling over. She listened without interruption, her expression hardening with each detail. When I was done, she stood up and closed her office door. "They've gotten bolder," she said, her voice tight with a cold anger. "This has been happening for years, Sage." A quiet understanding. A parent makes a significant donation to a professor's pet project or a new university building, and their child's academic troubles magically disappear. But expelling a brilliant student to cover their tracks? That's new. That's an escalation. She looked at me, her eyes searching my face. "Holloway is right about one thing," she said, and my heart sank. "You are not Blackwood material. You, and Liam, and the others like you, are better than this place. You have integrity." She came around her desk and put a hand on my shoulder. "So, the question is, what are you going to do about it?" Her words were a challenge, not a comfort. In that moment, something inside me shifted. The hurt, the despair, it all crystallized into a single, hard point of resolve. I wiped my eyes and stood up straight. "I'm not going to be another victim they sweep under the rug," I said, my voice steady for the first time in days. "I'm not going to let them win." A plan, audacious and dangerous, began to form in my mind. They think I'm a struggling student who can't keep up? Fine. That's exactly who I'll be. I'll fly so far under their radar they'll forget I even exist. And while they're ignoring me, I'm going to gather enough evidence to burn their entire corrupt system to the ground. The moment of decision was made. I was no longer a student, I was a hunter. My new life was a fractured existence, a carefully constructed performance of mediocrity. By day, I was the sage they expected me to be, flustered, overwhelmed, constantly on the verge of academic probation. I started turning in assignments that were deliberately average, riddled with just enough plausible errors to earn a C. I asked simplistic questions in class, feigning confusion over concepts I had mastered years ago. I wore my anxiety like a cloak, my shoulders perpetually slumped, my eyes downcast. It was a humiliating role to play, a betrayal of my own intellect, but it was the perfect camouflage. The professors who were part of the scheme, like Albright, began to treat me with a sort of smug pity. They saw my decline as a natural correction, proof that their system worked, that the charity cases would eventually weed themselves out. Dean Holloway would pass me in the halls and give me a sad, knowing smile, once even stopping to suggest I look into transferring to a less demanding state school. They thought they were watching me fail. In reality, they were watching me load the gun. By night, the real sage emerged. My dorm room, small and cramped, transformed into a war room. The walls were covered in a complex web of notes, connecting names, dates, and financial figures. I lived on cheap coffee and the adrenaline of my secret mission. I became a digital ghost, a forensic accountant, a private investigator. I taught myself advanced data mining techniques, spending hours sifting through Blackwood's public financial disclosures, cross-referencing them with the academic records of certain legacy students. The path was arduous and lonely. I pushed away the few friends I had made, unable to risk sharing my secret. Sleep became a luxury I couldn't afford. There were nights I'd be hunched over my laptop, my eyes burning, tracing a charitable donation from a parent company in Delaware to a professor's newly established and vaguely defined research fund, all while my own stomach growled with hunger because I'd spent my food money on a program to recover deleted files. The contrast between my life and the lives of those I was investigating was a constant, bitter pill. I'd scroll through social media and see pictures of Tristan Sterling and his friends on a yacht in the Mediterranean, laughing without a care in the world. Their captions would boast about working hard, playing hard, a grotesque irony that fueled my resolve. One post showed Tristan celebrating his surprise A in Albright's class, thanking the professor for believing in him. That was the same day I had to sell my grandfather's old watch, my most prized possession, to pay for a data recovery service. Their privilege wasn't just an advantage, it was a weapon used to grind people like me into the dust, and I was documenting every single blow. Slowly, cautiously, I began to realize I couldn't do this alone. I identified 3 other scholarship students who were facing similar, inexplicable academic struggles. There was Maya, a pre-med student whose lab results were constantly being lost, Ben, a history prodigy whose brilliant essays were being torn apart for stylistic weaknesses, and Chloe, a quiet math genius being stonewalled by her department head. I approached each of them in secret, in the dead of night, in the empty corners of the library. At first, they were terrified. They had been conditioned to keep their heads down, to be grateful, but I didn't approach them with suspicions, I approached them with preliminary evidence. I showed them the pattern, I showed them the flowchart on my wall, I showed them they weren't struggling because they were unworthy, they were being systematically targeted. Fear gave way to a slow-burning anger. We formed a small, secret council. We were a ragtag group with no money and no power, but we had the truth. They became my chosen family, my co-conspirators in this silent war, sharing information, offering support, and keeping watch for one another. The breakthrough came at 3:00 a.m. on a Wednesday. My eyes were raw, my back ached, but I was deep inside the university's server, looking through archived emails I'd accessed using a backdoor Liam had told me about before he left. And then I found it. The first piece of undeniable proof, an email chain between Professor Albright and Tristan Sterling's father. The subject line was, Tristan's progress. Mr. Sterling wrote about his son's unfortunate midterm grade and his concerns about his future. He then mentioned his deep interest in supporting the professor's new, unfunded research on 18th century economic models. Albright's reply was a masterpiece of corrupt subtlety. I am confident we can find a path for Tristan to demonstrate his full potential before the end of the semester, he wrote, and I would be delighted to discuss my research with you. The university is, as you know, matching all significant contributions to faculty projects. 2 days later, a $50,000 donation from Sterling Industries was made to Albright's research fund. The day after that, Tristan's grade was changed. I printed the emails, my hands shaking. It wasn't a smoking gun, it was a cannonball, and I knew exactly where I was going to aim it. The first fruit of my labor tasted like victory. With the Albright-Sterling emails as a template, the conspiracy began to unravel with astonishing speed. It was like pulling a single thread that caused the entire tapestry to fray. My small team and I worked with a new, feverish intensity. Ben, the history prodigy, used his skills to dig through university archives, finding patterns of donations to the arts faculty that coincided with grade changes for specific students going back a decade. Maya, the pre-med student, noticed that lab equipment for certain departments was often purchased from companies owned by the parents of students who miraculously recovered from failing grades. Chloe, the math genius, built a predictive algorithm that flagged suspicious grade distributions with 92% accuracy. My part was to tie it all together. My dorm room wall looked like something out of a crime thriller, a chaotic but beautiful map of corruption. I had spreadsheets linking donations to grade changes, timelines of academic appeals, and a list of over a dozen professors and nearly 40 students who were part of this systemic fraud. It was bigger and more organized than I had ever imagined. We had them. We had a case so airtight it could suffocate them. My major achievement wasn't a degree or an award, it was this secret explosive dossier that held the power to decapitate the university's corrupt leadership. The turning point, the moment that shifted the dynamic from a secret investigation to an active offensive, came from the most unexpected source, Tristan Sterling himself. He had skated by for years on his father's money, but he finally ran into a problem that a discreet donation couldn't fix. He was caught red-handed cheating on his final ethics exam. The irony was so thick I could have choked on it. The exam was administered by an external proctoring service, a new university policy implemented after a minor cheating scandal the previous year. The evidence was digital, time-stamped, and irrefutable. His father's frantic calls to the dean were useless. The external service had already filed its report. Tristan was facing immediate expulsion and public disgrace. In a state of pure panic, he came to me. He must have heard whispers from other students, or perhaps his own guilty conscience made him see me differently. He found me in the library, looking desperate and, for the first time, utterly powerless. "I heard you're good with finding things," he stammered, his usual arrogance replaced by a raw fear. "They're going to expel me. My dad can't stop it." I saw my opening. It wasn't about helping him, it was about using him. "Why should I help you, Tristan?" I asked, my voice cold. "You stood by and watched my friend Liam get expelled for something you did. He had the grace to look ashamed." "I know," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "I was a coward, but I'll do anything. Anything you want." I made a deal with him. I would use my knowledge of the university's digital systems to find a loophole in the proctoring service's code of conduct, a procedural error that could get his case thrown out. In exchange, he had to give me everything. His father's private contact lists, login details for family accounts, any correspondence he had ever seen related to his academic support. He agreed without hesitation. As I worked on his case, I decided to take a gamble. I sat him down in my dorm room and showed him everything: the emails, the spreadsheets, the entire web of deceit on my wall, with his own name circled in red multiple times. I showed him the proof that his entire academic career at Blackwood was a lie he and his father had purchased. He stared at the wall, his face going from confusion to disbelief, and finally to a deep, gut-wrenching horror. He wasn't a monster. He was just a weak, spoiled boy who had never been forced to confront the reality of his privilege. Seeing it all laid out, seeing Liam's name next to his own, broke something in him. "I'm a fraud," he said, looking at his hands as if they belonged to someone else. "Everything I've done here, it was all fake." In that moment, the golden child's pedestal crumbled to dust. He was no longer an antagonist. He was my asset, my inside source, and a surprisingly willing new ally. Meanwhile, the architects of the conspiracy remained blissfully unaware. My own grades were now hovering just above failing. Dean Holloway saw me one afternoon and gave me a pamphlet for mental health services. "No shame in admitting you're in over your head, Miss Delacroix," he said with that infuriating, patronizing smile. Professor Albright graded my final paper with a D, adding a note that said, "Perhaps this field isn't for you." Their obliviousness was my greatest shield. They saw a drowning girl, not the shark circling beneath the surface. Then, the invitations arrived. Gilded, embossed cards delivered to the entire university community, inviting us to the annual Benefactor's Gala. It was Blackwood's most prestigious event, a night to honor the wealthy donors, the Sterlings, the DuPonts, and all the others whose money kept the system running. The keynote speaker was scheduled to be Dean Holloway. I held the invitation in my hand, a flimsy piece of cardstock that felt as heavy as a death sentence, but it wasn't for me, it was for them. Tristan, now my mole, secured me a position as a student volunteer for the event. The stage was set, the confrontation was coming. The ballroom of the Grand Blackwood Hotel was a nauseating spectacle of opulence. Chandeliers dripped crystals like frozen tears, and tables groaned under the weight of floral arrangements that cost more than my semester's worth of groceries. I moved through the crowd, a tray of champagne flutes balanced on my hand, my server's uniform a perfect costume of invisibility. The air was thick with expensive perfume and the self-congratulatory laughter of the 1%. They saw me, but they didn't see me. I was just part of the furniture, a silent functionary in their gilded world. After an hour of clinking glasses and empty platitudes, Dean Holloway approached the grand mahogany podium. He beamed at the crowd, a benevolent king surveying his loyal, wealthy subjects. He spoke of tradition, of excellence, of the unwavering standards that made Blackwood a beacon of higher learning. And then he looked out across the sea of faces, and his eyes, for a brief, chilling moment, landed on me as I stood near the back wall. "Of course," he said, his voice oozing false sincerity, "we also believe in opportunity. We open our doors to students from all walks of life, but our standards remain absolute." We cannot and will not lower our expectations. It is an unfortunate reality that some, despite our best intentions, simply cannot keep up with the rigorous pace here. They are not, at their core, Blackwood material. A ripple of smug, knowing chuckles went through the audience of wealthy parents. It was a public execution of my character, a final, condescending insult delivered on the grandest stage possible. He was using my feigned failure as a prop to legitimize his corrupt system. The sting of it was sharp, but it was immediately replaced by a cold, thrilling calm. This was it. This was the moment. I gave a subtle nod to Tristan, who was stationed near the audio-visual booth. As if on cue, the giant presentation screen behind Dean Holloway flickered and went dark. The dean tapped the microphone. Ahem, a slight technical difficulty it seems, he stammered, flustered. That was my cue. I set my tray down on a nearby table, my hands perfectly steady. I walked out of the shadows at the back of the room and headed directly for the stage. A few heads turned, confused. A security guard started to move toward me, but Professor Sharma, seated at a table near the front, stood up and blocked his path with a look that could stop a train. I didn't run. I walked up the steps to the stage and stood at the podium next to the sputtering dean. I leaned into the microphone. My voice, when it came out, was not loud, but it was clear and it cut through the murmuring in the room like a shard of glass. My name is Sage Delacroix, I said, my eyes scanning the shocked faces in the crowd. And I'm one of those scholarship students Dean Holloway was just talking about. The ones who can't keep up. I paused, letting the silence stretch. And he's right about one thing. The standards here are incredibly hard to keep up with. Especially when they are for sale. As I said the last word, the screen behind me flickered back to life. But it wasn't the university logo that appeared. It was the email. The email from Mr. Claude Meister Steven Peters, Entald. Sterling to Professor Albright, blown up to 20 feet high for everyone to see. A collective gasp swept through the ballroom. I didn't raise my voice. I simply narrated the evidence. This is an email from Arthur Sterling to Professor Albright, I stated calmly, discussing a path for his son Tristan after a failing grade. And this, the screen changed to a bank statement, is the $50,000 donation made to the professor's research fund 2 days later. Click, the screen changed again. A spreadsheet appeared, my masterpiece of forensic accounting, detailing over a dozen similar transactions, linking powerful names in the audience to corrupt professors. Click, an audio file began to play, a recording of a phone call Tristan had made to another professor's office on my instruction, where the professor explicitly offered a grade change for a contribution to the new library wing. The blood drained from Dean Holloway's face. He looked like a ghost. The room was utterly silent, the only sound my voice, steady and relentless, and the quiet clicks as I moved through the evidence. A journalist I had tipped off, a firebrand from a national newspaper, was standing on a chair, her phone recording everything. Then, the final, beautiful act of defiance began. Professor Sharma, her face a mask of proud fury, walked from her table to the stage and stood directly beside me, placing a supportive hand on my back. A moment later, from different corners of the room, Ben, Maya, and Chloe stood up from their volunteer posts and began walking toward the stage. My chosen family, my council of rebels, assembling in the heart of the enemy's fortress. The final blow came from Tristan. He emerged from the AV booth and walked onto the stage, not to stand beside me, but to face the audience. To face his own father, who was staring at him, his face contorted in a rictus of horror and betrayal. Tristan stood with us, with the scholarship kids, with the truth. The shifting of allegiance was complete. We were a line of 5, backed by undeniable proof, while the so-called pillars of the community, the dean, the professors, the wealthy parents, were left exposed, isolated, and stripped of all their power under the harsh glare of the truth. They were no longer titans, they were just criminals in expensive suits. The aftermath of the Benefactor's Gala was not a storm, it was a detonation. The journalist's story went viral overnight, and Blackwood University became the epicenter of a national scandal. The story was everywhere, a satisfying narrative of hubris and comeuppance. Investigations were launched, not by the university, but by the state attorney's office. The digital and financial evidence my team and I had compiled was so thorough, so irrefutable, that the corrupt faculty and administration had nowhere to hide. Dean Holloway was fired in disgrace, Professor Albright and a dozen others were stripped of their tenure and faced legal charges. The wealthy parents, including Tristan's father, were embroiled in a messy public scandal that tarnished their reputations and triggered audits of their charitable foundations. The university, its reputation in tatters, was forced to clean house from the top down. A new interim president was brought in with a mandate for radical transparency and reform. My new reality was surreal. I went from being an invisible failure to the public face of a student-led revolution. Rival universities, smelling blood in the water, reached out with offers of full scholarships, graduate programs, a clean slate, but I turned them all down. I had no interest in abandoning the battlefield. I chose to stay, to help rebuild Blackwood into the institution it had always pretended to be. I was asked to co-chair the new Student Oversight and Ethics Committee, a position with real power to shape policy and ensure this could never happen again. In the quiet months that followed, the antagonists began to reckon with their new reality. There was no single moment of tearful remorse, no cinematic apology tour. It was a slow, humbling, and painful process for them. Dean Holloway faded into obscurity. I heard he was selling real estate in a different state. Tristan's father, Arthur Sterling, was forced into a settlement with the Attorney General's office. His public apology was clumsy and lawyer-vetted, but the private conversation he had with his son, which Tristan later recounted to me, was one of profound, gutting shame. His illusion of a meritocratic world where his son succeeded on his own steam had been shattered. He didn't magically become a good person, but the arrogance that defined him was gone, replaced by a weary sense of disgrace. As for Tristan, he had to face the consequences. He wasn't expelled thanks to a plea deal his father's lawyers made in exchange for full cooperation with the investigation. But he was suspended for a year and stripped of all his previous credits. He had to reapply to Blackwood on his own merits and start again from zero, this time without a safety net. The entitled boy who had come to me in a panic was gone. In his place was a quiet, sober young man who was, for the first time, trying to earn his place in the world. My relationship with the new Blackwood administration was built on a foundation of cautious respect. I was no longer a supplicant, I was a partner. I had a seat at the table where the new rules were being written. My committee and I established firm, unbreakable boundaries. All major donations were to be made public and channeled through a blind trust, completely disconnected from the academic faculty. A new, independent ombudsman's office was created for student grievances, with the power to launch its own investigations. Forgiveness for the institution wasn't given freely, it had to be earned every single day through transparent action. My forgiveness for Tristan was conditional too. We were not friends, but we were allies in the cause of a better Blackwood. The power dynamic had shifted permanently. Looking back, the most profound lesson I learned wasn't about justice or revenge, it was about worth. For so long, I had allowed my value to be defined by their grades, their opinions, their condescending smiles. I fought so hard because I wanted them to admit I was worthy. But standing on that stage, with the truth displayed behind me, I realized my worth was never in their hands. It wasn't something they could grant or deny. It was forged in the fire of my mother's sacrifice, honed by the late nights in the library, and solidified by the integrity I refused to compromise. Adversity hadn't broken me, it had built me. True strength isn't the absence of struggle, it's the refusal to surrender your principles in the face of it. And I learned that the family you choose, the quiet professor, the fellow outcasts, the reformed enemy can build a foundation far stronger than one built on money and power. My story had a dramatic end, but so many fights for what is right happen in quiet, unseen ways. Have you ever had to stand up for something you believe in, even when it was scary? Share your story in the comments below, because every one of those moments matters. Thank you for watching. If this story resonated with you, please hit that like button, subscribe for more content, and share this video with someone who needs to hear it. Remember, your value is not determined by the opinions of others, it is determined by your actions, your integrity, and the courage you show when no one is watching.